They are the two great powers of the 21st century, staring each other down across a great oceanic divide. On the one side, the United States stands entrenched in a position of strength after 80 years as the leader of the Western world. On the other is China, rising, hungry, ambitious, and increasingly ready to bloody its knuckles in its first real fight in generations. At this moment in history, the stakes seem clear, with each side prepared to engage the other in what will be a new and bitter Cold War. But what if that war turned hot before a Cold War ever got the chance to get going? From flashpoints in Taiwan and the Philippines, to a belligerent and combative White House, to a CCP that appears to be gaining confidence, strength, and nuclear warheads all at the same time, there are no guarantees that the 2020s will pass without a direct confrontation between the US and China. So if that war were to break out in the next few years, how would it work? What military strength would each side bring to bear? How and where would the battles play out? And who would win? Allies and location. At the outset of today's episode, let's make one thing very clear. The confrontation that we're talking about between the United States and China is World War III. Both in terms of the sheer power of the two nations involved and in terms of the alliance networks and international defensive partnerships that would come into play if the US and China started exchanging fire. There is just no way that an extended confrontation could play out without the world getting involved. So before we get into the military strength of each side, we've got to discuss the friends that they'll be bringing to the fight. Now, the United States has cultivated a strong network of alliances across the Indo-Pacific region, including two major regional powers on China's doorstep. Japan, on the other side of the East China Sea, has been geopolitically inseparable from the US for the last half-century, while South Korea, bordering a Chinese vassal state and separated from Beijing only by the Yellow Sea, has rapidly grown in strength as it's extended its partnership with Washington. Both nations host major US military installations and tens of thousands of American troops. More soldiers maintain a strong presence across 9 bases in the Philippines, and Manila considers itself an ally of Washington, as does the nation of Vietnam, now half a century removed from the two nations' time at war. The enclave of Taiwan, although not formally recognized by the United States, is openly regarded as a bulwark of American interest in the Pacific, and the island government is backed strongly by the US in a practical sense. Elsewhere in the region, Australia and Thailand must be taken into account, although because of the World War III nature of this potential conflict, other US allies won't be factored in to a direct battle with China. The European nations of NATO in such a scenario would likely have their hands full with an opportunistic Chinese ally in Russia, while Israel and Saudi Arabia could expect both a confrontation with Iran and a very messy situation across the rest of the Middle East. Coming in on the side of China, North Korea must be taken into account, offering little in terms of modern weaponry, but abundant human lives to be thrown into the meat grinder of the 21st century war. Nuclear-armed North Korea is functionally a vassal state to China, albeit a frequently disobedient one, with a tendency to cause major headaches for Beijing, and it would almost certainly enter hostilities on the side of China. Two other nations in the region, Pakistan and Indonesia, have both considerable militaries of their own and significant defense relationships with China, although it's far less likely that they'd come to China's aid in a direct confrontation with the United States. Other close Chinese allies in the region, like the military regime in Myanmar, have their own problems to deal with, while it's more likely that India would fight against China if it entered the conflict at all, than the world's two most populous nations fighting hand in hand. The simple geography of a confrontation between China and the US would thus favor the US by a substantial margin. While China is very strong on its own soil, it is surrounded by a geographic net of US allies, some of which are host to their own strong militaries, major deployments of American troops, or both. China, and along with it North Korea, are functionally boxed into a corner from which they'd need to either break out or find some other way to change the game if they were to take the fight to the US directly. Add to that the fact that Taiwan presents a convenient and strategically critical battleground on China's doorstep, and the fact that the United States can more easily island hop its assets towards China via Hawaii and Guam than China could island hop to the US or even break out into the open Pacific. Altogether, a large-scale military engagement between the two nations is all but assured to take place in and around the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Philippine Sea, and the many Indo-Pacific nations in China's immediate orbit. Now, China could certainly disrupt that balance through means we'll discuss later on, and yes, we'll also be exploring the nuclear option that could make this whole conversation pretty darn irrelevant. But If those two sides are going to battle conventionally, World War II style, then it'll happen near China and not near America. For both sides, that comes with advantages and disadvantages. The United States gets to minimize damage to the home front, but will have to transport most of its assets across the world's largest ocean on short notice, while dodging attempts by China and its allies to destroy those assets in transit. China, by contrast, gets to fight on its own turf at a range where its air and naval assets will be highly relevant, but it will have to reckon with the fact that its home territory is well within range of the militaries it'll be fighting, and it's going to have to plan on a confrontation with over half a dozen nations beyond America itself. Armament and conditions. Alright, so that's the who and the where of a war between the US and China. Let's now talk about the how. The armament and broader military strength that'll be brought to bear on both sides. Now, for posterity's sake, we will touch on a few important points about the various allies that'll play a part in this fight, but for the most part, we're going to focus on the two superpowers that will make up the bulk of the fighting forces on either side. We'll start with China, boasting a total military strength of over 2 million active duty personnel, making its armed forces the largest in the world by a considerable margin. The People's Liberation Army ground force alone fields 1 million active duty soldiers, divided into 35 separate armies that boast all the trappings of a modern military. The nation fields thousands upon thousands of artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers, 4,000 modern main battle tanks, and hundreds of deadly attack helicopters, plus innumerable unmanned drones and other vehicles. The nation's air force is easily among the best in the world, bringing over 200 fifth-generation stealth fighters to bear, along with hundreds of other air superiority and multi-role aircraft, 200 light bombers, and more than 200 copies of its twin-engine heavy bomber, the Xi'an H-6. It flies all the reconnaissance, logistical, and airborne control aircraft that a modern superpower air force could ask for, and the Rocket Force, a separate branch of the military, is responsible for an incredible volume of cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missiles. China's Navy is actually made up of 3 separate forces: the Navy proper, the immensely powerful Coast Guard, and a separate maritime militia, altogether fielding well over 700 surface vessels, including 3 aircraft carriers, a combined 120 or more destroyers and frigates, and dozens of attack submarines. China also fields specialized ships that can build a bridge from sea to land, and it sails hundreds of civilian ferries that do double duty as tank and troop transports, making China an increasingly potent threat in amphibious operations. On the other side of the cage match is the United States, bringing the world's 3rd most powerful military at 1.3 million active duty personnel, plus the absolute pinnacle of technological sophistication of any military on Earth. Like China, the US fields thousands upon thousands of self-propelled howitzers, towed artillery, and multiple rocket launchers, backing up 450,000 active duty soldiers and an additional 500,000 combined National Guard and Reserve troops. The United States has about 3,000 modern main battle tanks ready to go, out of a total of 8,000 or more when reserves are taken into account, along with all manner of other fighting vehicles and nearly 1,000 attack helicopters. The United States Air Force flies over 600 fifth-generation fighter jets at present, including 165 fight-ready copies of its F-22 Raptor, widely hailed as the greatest air superiority aircraft ever made. Those fighters backed up by well over 1,000 other fighter and attack aircraft, plus 3 different kinds of strategic bomber, including 18 operational copies of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The US is unmatched in its logistical and support capacities in the air, with those capabilities only reinforced by the thousands of additional combat and support aircraft in the arsenal of the Navy and Marine Corps. Speaking of them, the Navy fields a stunning 11 aircraft carriers in total, plus well over 100 other surface combat vessels out of a cumulative 460 ships in service. Meanwhile, the Marines will bring nearly 170,000 riflemen dedicated to amphibious and expeditionary warfare, as well as their own long list of fighting equipment that's going to ruin somebody's day. Finally, while experimental assets like America's F-47 or China's J-36 fighter aircraft are mostly counted out of this fight since they're not yet developed, the US has one other critical asset to take into account: the B-21 Raider, an even more sophisticated strategic stealth bomber that's now in mainline production, with a small handful expected to be available within the next couple of years. Elsewhere in this fight, the allies of each nation have a few notable assets that demand recognition. North Korea comes in on China's side with sheer manpower, bringing 1.3 million active-duty personnel of its own, nearly rivaling the US on raw numbers before China even comes into the equation. The Japanese military brings substantial heavy armor on the ground, 2 light aircraft carriers and dozens of destroyers and frigates on the sea, and hundreds of hard-hitting fighter aircraft in the air. South Korea, despite just 500,000 active-duty personnel, leverages over 3 million reservists, as well as over 2,500 modern main battle tanks, an incredible amount of artillery, and more than enough air power to hold its own. Australia, though a small military, brings high-quality, well-trained troops and formidable modern capabilities, while Thailand, Vietnam, and Taiwan taken together bring over 1.6 million more active-duty troops with enough equipment and capability to make them quite meaningful as part of a larger war effort. Just as important as hardware is the home front, where China has prepared for generations to surge into action in the event the war breaks out. China has long invested in the idea of dual-use technologies, everything from manufacturing capacity to social censorship and control mechanisms to agricultural production that can shift from civil capacity into a war footing on short notice and to great effect. Chinese citizens are believed to be relatively prepared for the prospect of war, or at least as prepared as any population can be, and they live under a government that's well practiced in maintaining public order even under difficult circumstances. The United States, by contrast, is a good deal less prepared. After decades of atrophy in its manufacturing capacity, America isn't nearly as ready to pivot into tangible support of a war effort as it was during World War II or the Cold War. At the same time, it's an open question whether US citizens, both deeply polarized at home and accustomed to the trappings that come with being the richest nation on earth, would be willing and able to endure a prolonged conflict with a worthy adversary. Over the last several months, new leadership in Washington has shaken the faith of its allies abroad, introducing unnecessary instability and uncertainty into its own networks of global support and reducing faith in America's willingness to support its friends abroad. Critical production shortfalls, like shipbuilding and artillery shell manufacturing, have only just begun to be addressed, with so much work to be done that it'll probably take the better part of a decade to swing into action, and that's an optimistic estimate. Meanwhile, China has taken its own shipbuilding capacity to new levels, churning out immense numbers of vessels as its larger arms industry proves its ability to manufacture high-quality warfighting equipment at scale. At the same time, it's built airports and seaports all across the Pacific Ocean, often under the guise of civilian construction projects, but with clear dual-use potential to give China access to the islands of the Pacific in times of conflict. With that comes both increased logistical capacity and an increased ability to establish direct control over a wider geographical area than the geography of the constrained Chinese mainland would suggest. There are a handful of intangibles to account for as well. The United States is in a state of self-admitted waning military readiness, meaning that it's not quite as ready to snap into action as it once was. Meanwhile, although China's true force readiness is unknown, it's thought to promote its leaders for loyalty rather than competence as a sort of coup-proofing mechanism, while it's demonstrated tactics and strategic awareness during military exercises that's left something to be desired. Then again, it's China that would probably make the decision to go to war first, owing to its clear ambition to capture and subjugate Taiwan, as opposed to an overall lack of interest by the US to attack China outright. China's force preparation is substantially more in doubt. The US has spent decades fighting near constant wars across the globe and acting as a worldwide security guarantor, granting its troops critical experience that China has no way to match, meaning that it's entirely possible that China's untested approach to war might break apart under strain. Also causing problems for China is the clear role of corruption all across the Chinese military, which appears to be quite pervasive despite recent crackdowns. Conversely, the US deals with its own problems via domestic political turmoil, with that turmoil growing so severe that China could even decide to play the long game, as it usually does, sit on its laurels and wait for the polarized United States to diminish and divide itself all on its own. Another reason for China to play the long game is its population. Rapidly aging and unlikely to easily tolerate the loss of hundreds of thousands or potentially even millions of its younger members in an avoidable war. Finally, we've got to at least briefly discuss two recent statements from the US that some of our more politically attuned viewers might be aware of. The first is an admission made by US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who claims in a recent interview that Chinese hypersonic missiles can, quote, take out 10 aircraft carriers in the first 20 minutes of the conflict, and that the US, quote, loses to China in every war game. Now, there are a few reasons that we're going to decline to take this quote at face value. War games are typically run in ways that favor one side or the other. They typically account for weapons that haven't been used directly in combat by assuming that those weapons pose the highest possible threat in order to avoid being caught off guard later, and we don't know anything about the context in which Hegseth was speaking. We've also got to point out that Hegseth, as the Secretary of Defense, has real incentives to portray and claim major weaknesses in America's current defense apparatus, since public concern around America's vulnerability makes it far easier to justify military spending down the line. The other claim came from Donald Trump and actually went in exactly the opposite direction from Hegseth, quoting here, "We have stuff that you haven't even seen or heard about. We have stuff that Putin and Xi have never heard about before. There's nobody. What we have is incredible. There are systems that nobody knows about." End quote. Now, we certainly wouldn't put it past America to have a superweapon or two in its back pocket, but for our purposes today, there's really nothing actionable about that statement that we can factor into an evaluation except to shrug and suppose that if Trump is telling the truth, then the fundamental reality of a war with China is different than what we've laid out. We can't say how, we can't say why, and we can't be confident that this is even a serious statement, so we just cannot factor it in. Hopefully, then, our choice not to take either of those statements to heart makes a bit more sense to you. The course of battle. So, with each side prepared for battle, it's time to lay out a vision of what a war between China and the United States might look like. To be clear, there are innumerable ways that this conflict could play out, and we're not going to run through every single iteration today, although if you'd like to see a longer episode where we play out a number of different scenarios, let us know in the comments below. Instead, we're going to play out one single version of how things could go, resting on two core assumptions. Assumption number one, the war doesn't go nuclear, and yes, we'll be discussing a nuclear exchange at the end of today's episode, so suspend your disbelief for now. And assumption number two, both sides will be fighting to the best of their ability, with the option to leverage and fight alongside their regional allies, and with no reservations about attacking each other. Again, that's an assumption, and if that assumption were to change in any number of ways, the complexion of the conflict would, of course, be very different as well. So let's assume that World War III begins with a surprise attack by China against Taiwan. China, with its forces prepared for battle, immediately begins a thrust across the South China Sea to reach its adversary, and across the world, dominoes begin to fall in short order. Russia and the European nations of NATO lock up into a confrontation. The Middle East evolves into insanity. A few other minor dimensions of the conflict crop up across the globe, and China assaults Taiwan with absolute intensity. Now, Taiwan, as we've covered in other episodes on this channel, would likely be able to deal substantial damage to China before it goes down. Taiwan has structured its military with the intent of being able to inflict immense pain on China to deter it from attacking, but the thing about that is that if China does choose to attack, then Taiwan has resigned itself to a painful, bitter demise unless its allies can come in and help. Now, conventional wisdom has long held that US forces in the Pacific would be able to intervene and hold China off for long enough that reinforcements could arrive, but as we write this in the year 2025, those assumptions may no longer hold true. The biggest problem that the United States and an allied intervention force would face in and around Taiwan is the sheer volume of Chinese assets active in that area. Situated so close to the mainland, aircraft carriers and other force-projecting tools would be practically irrelevant for China because of its ability to use China itself as a launchpad for aircraft, missiles, and ships. And speaking of missiles and ships, China is able to leverage so many ballistic and cruise missiles at that range and place so many combat-ready vessels into a small pocket of sea that it can essentially deny that naval and airspace to adversary forces. And right now, the United States just doesn't have enough to break through. Let's be generous to the US here and say that in advance of war, America has been able to position a full one-half of its naval assets in the Indo-Pacific. It can't place 100% of its assets there. After all, it has to project force elsewhere, protect vital trade routes, and protect the homeland all at once. But although our hypothetical US could still send some 5 carrier strike groups to the Pacific while leveraging its asset stations in South Korea, Japan, and Guam, China still has the US badly outnumbered on the sea, while being able to target warships that come close to Taiwan with some very, very nasty missiles. Not only that, but American carrier-based aircraft would need to go head-to-head with China's own stealth fighters, backed up by an immense volume of anti-aircraft defenses on the Chinese mainland. All the while, the addition of China's new landing barges would allow the nation to surge troops onto Taiwan far faster than any previous estimates suggested, and protecting those barges is quite possible because of the incredible volume of forces that it can concentrate in and around Taiwan. Add the disruptive effects of a coordinated assault by North Korea toward the south, possibly also launching missiles against Japan, and US and allied forces in the region would likely be stretched too thin to protect Taiwan. And that problem gets even worse when the US is forced to withdraw even more of its maritime assets to protect the troop carriers moving at full steam across the Pacific, loaded up with troops and heavy weapons, but practically sitting ducks if they're left unprotected against China's longer-range ballistic missiles. Now, let's really put into words what these two sides are capable of. The United States brings highly advanced military assets, but no easy way to reinforce the Indo-Pacific quickly enough to go head-to-head with China, while its forward-deployed forces there just don't seem to be enough to break through the sort of concentrated assault that China could bring to bear against Taiwan. What the US does have, however, are long-range strategic bombers, other long-range weapons with a decent likelihood of breaking through, and ships and aircraft that can hold their own as long as they aren't fed needlessly into the maw of a Chinese offensive. Meanwhile, China has forces that can be overwhelming when they're clustered in small areas, but that quickly lose their potency when asked to attack outward in all directions. But China also has a military-industrial capacity that currently surpasses America's by a considerable margin. What that means, at least by our estimation, is that in an ideal world for the United States, this conflict resolves similarly to Operation Desert Storm, a shock-and-awe offensive highly dependent on air power in which an overwhelming show of force can destroy China's offensive capabilities and force it into line. Conversely, China is favored in a longer war, one where it can leverage its immense military-industrial capacity, take its time swallowing up the territory of its regional adversaries, and draw the United States into a numbers game that it does not seem well-equipped to win. But between the two of them, it's China that's more able to force its preferred style of conflict. Even if American strategic bombers can break through, it'll mostly be the stealthy B-2 and any available B-21s that are of value, given that the unstealthy B-1 and B-52s are practically sitting ducks against a peer adversary, especially when that peer adversary brings stealth aircraft to deal with the stealth aircraft escorting the heavy bombers. That leaves just a handful of stealth bombers, possibly as few as a dozen, to deal such intense damage to China that it's forced to back down, and that just ain't likely. Add to that the fact that even the stealthiest aircraft are visible to the naked eye, a much larger problem when they're attacking a nation with both the ability to track reports in real time and get their own highly potent aerial assets in the area to respond against stealthy but slow aircraft. Meanwhile, US ships on the sea would have very little to gain by trying to attack China directly. At such a numerical disadvantage, the US's more advanced ships, they can only get so far. Instead, having to make do with a serious deficit in force size, those ships would be better off attempting a blockade, levering Japanese, Philippine, and if possible, South Korean territory as forward operating zones for land-based assets. In short, it's not likely that the US could rally the overwhelming strength required to pull off a Desert Storm-style victory, and once that critical window of opportunity closes, the war moves into China's style of fight. With the US and its allies basically forced to hold a perimeter, and with Taiwan probably fallen or severely diminished by this time, China can set about creating a longer and more geographically dynamic war. Transitioning into a wartime economy, China can leverage its incredible shipbuilding capacity to even greater effect, churning out landing craft, combat ships, and perhaps even additional aircraft carriers at high rates. Although the US may attempt to bolster the defenses of its allies in South Asia, primarily Vietnam and Thailand, those nations may either face a direct military threat from China over land, or more likely, choose to stand down with the knowledge that the US probably can't save them. Again, China's sheer mass of surface vessels, missiles, and mainland-based aerial assets means that actually getting troops to Vietnam or Thailand, at least by traveling directly, would be very difficult, and any longer route would require the US to redistribute even more of its maritime assets to protect ships in transit. American strategic airlifters could make up the gap, but only somewhat. Just take a recent example where experts raised concerns in April after the US took over 70 flights of its C-17 cargo planes to transport a single Patriot missile battalion from Asia to the Middle East. Like any other US asset, those aircraft are a finite resource, and like other US assets, China will target them if they dare to come into range during a period of total war. Assuming that neither the US nor China have broken out the nuclear warheads by this stage, it'll be China using its vast array of troop transport vessels, plus an amphibious assault capability that's expected to grow rapidly in the near future to start taking tougher territories like the Philippines or even South Korea. We say tougher here because the United States is more likely to be able to position forces to defend, and because, as a result, those nations will likely have a greater will to stand up to China and its auxiliary forces from North Korea. But although the US home front can rest easy, knowing that the ongoing battles are taking place far from their shores, the war's close proximity to the Chinese mainland is as much a blessing as a curse. China would have to absorb a good deal of pain by way of strikes against its military-industrial base, but there's simply so much to destroy that China can take blows on the chin that would stagger a less equipped nation. It's through a series of successive assaults like this that China could break down the US assets working to blockade it, forcing America to commit its nearby troops to the defense of close allies despite China's immense military power in the region. Those are battles that US troops would struggle to win unless America could somehow reposition an immense portion of its military, but they are battles that the US would also struggle to walk away from. Not only would those battles be in defense of vital US allies like South Korea or even Japan, they'd also be the only way to keep China cut off from the rest of the Pacific, mostly unable to reach the far-flung island airports and seaports that could allow it to rapidly project power toward the Pacific center. But as important as those battles would be for America, there'd also be battles where relatively small portions of the US military, numbering in the tens or maybe in the low hundreds of thousands if America is lucky, are going up against China at the very height of its powers. The geographic reality of such a war is that while America must stretch thin, China can concentrate its forces. Where American forces must travel over 5,000 miles to reach the battlefield, China can sail a few hundred miles, or in the case of South Korea or Vietnam, its troops can even walk there. China can afford to lose ships while destroying American vessels because China can rebuild the ships it loses, while America can't. In fact, it could skip the battles against US allies on their turf, attack American naval power directly, trust its shipbuilding base to make up the losses, and force nations like Japan or South Korea to capitulate once America is no longer able to project power. It is a nightmare scenario for American military planners, but it is an unavoidable reality. A few dozen destroyers and frigates just cannot stand up to the power of the Chinese military on its own mainland indefinitely. And unlike China, America will have to deal with the fact that if it loses a ship, that ship isn't being replaced inside the next decade. In the near term, China can grind out a costly, highly attritional victory in its own sphere of influence, eventually battering down the US and its allies enough in a several hundred-mile radius of the Chinese coast that it can take over that critical zone. From there, the US has only limited means to stop China from expanding across its half of the Pacific, setting up confrontations in the open ocean that again come back to naval power. It's here that we would expect something of a stalemate to develop. China will eventually have enough of a true ocean-going navy to beat the US there, and every ship the US loses brings China closer to that reality, but China doesn't have that military strength yet, and would need at least a few years to offset American naval power in the open waters of the Central Pacific. With that stalemate may come a peace settlement and a nominal end to the war, but make no mistake, such an outcome would be an unequivocal victory for China. The nation would have massively expanded its sphere of influence, practically taken over East Asia, reduced the warfighting capacity of the United States in a major way, and forced the US to accept once and for all that it's no longer the sole superpower on Earth. Or perhaps, not even the dominant one. It's a conclusion that doesn't involve either nation directly invading the other's mainland. Nobody gets a total victory, and such a resolution may end up being the calm before an even greater storm. But it's difficult to see either side carrying on the war if China can break through to the open Pacific, and neither side is willing to use nuclear weapons. To reiterate, this is just one among countless ways that such a war could play out. Some of them end with inexperienced and naive Chinese generals slipping on banana peels until a resounding American victory. Some of them involve a successful defense of Taiwan. Some of them even involve such immense pressure placed on the Chinese government that we see regime change in Beijing. Others end with just as favorable a conclusion for China. Others end in a way that leaves nobody feeling as if they won. The scenario that would ultimately play out is a matter of adjusted inputs and outputs, a precise configuration of advantages and disadvantages that represents reality when the conflict starts, and a long cascade of cause and effect from there onward. But we've chosen one in which China does have real success, not simply to drive controversy or grab attention, but because China's combination of military assets and defense industrial capacity make it an immensely dangerous foe when it's fighting within range of its own mainland. Faced with that sort of foe, the United States can pull back to open ocean areas where it stands a much better chance of victory. But to do that, it would have to cede Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, Guam, and more. And that, in the current state of affairs, just isn't going to happen. The other conclusion. But then, there's the other way that this could all go, a full-scale nuclear exchange. Of course, we all know what happens if this version of the future ultimately plays out. The world's nuclear nations launch whatever they've got, hundreds of million people perish, if not more, and in the end, everybody loses. But while the ultimate conclusion is not in doubt, we can at least ask two key questions. What does each side have? And more importantly, when would each side choose to press that big red button? Right now, the United States is estimated to have just shy of 1,800 nuclear warheads deployed and ready to launch at a moment's notice, as well as nearly 2,000 more currently in reserve. Those warheads are deliverable by all three dimensions of America's nuclear triad: strategic bombing, the launch of ballistic missiles from submarines, and the launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles from silos in the United States. China, by contrast, is believed to possess some 600 nuclear warheads at the time of writing, on track to reach 1,000 or more by the end of the decade, and while most of those missiles are currently thought to be in storage, they probably wouldn't stay there if China felt it was at the edge of a confrontation with Uncle Sam. China also has a nuclear triad, able to deliver warheads via land-based or submarine-based missile or by strategic bomber. And we've also got to factor in North Korea, estimated to carry somewhere around 50 to 60 nuclear missiles launched by land and possibly from submarines as well. But it's very important to remember that the mere fact that the US and China would go to war doesn't necessarily mean that a nuclear exchange is absolutely going to happen. It is possible for nuclear-armed nations to engage in conflict without deploying their nuclear warheads. Just take China's recent border skirmishes with neighboring India as an example. Instead, if either side can avoid its own nuclear annihilation, it'll typically choose to do so, but not always. Going back to the version of events that we played out in the last section, we've got to point out that if any side is going to use nuclear weapons first, it's probably going to be the United States. There are, of course, a few things that could goad China into first use. A direct attack on the Three Gorges Dam, for example, which, if destroyed, could kill tens of millions of people. So too might China respond with nuclear force in the event of an all-out bombing of Beijing, or in the event of a conventional attack designed to destroy China's nuclear assets. But when we explained before that the combination of lesser force concentration in the area and lesser ability to win the long-term war decided by industrial capacity would push the US toward attempting a shock-and-awe victory to stun and decapitate Beijing, we didn't say that necessarily would come by conventional means. If the US has committed to full-scale war with Beijing and assesses, as we do, that a rapid and overwhelming assault provides the best chance of victory, then that's a scenario where a surprise nuclear assault may, unfortunately, make some degree of strategic sense. Or, that is, perhaps an American leader crazy enough could convince themselves that rolling the dice on a nuclear strike could have a better chance of resolving the conflict than fighting a harsh attritional war that the US might be primed to lose. The other scenario in which the US might be really tempted to use its nuclear weapons, if it hasn't already, is once China begins a break toward the center of the Pacific. In one scenario, the United States might panic, with its leadership not bothering to wait and see whether China will agree to a truce, or assuming that even if a truce were agreed, the losses that the US has suffered would simply be too great to bear. In another scenario, China might not agree to a peace once it achieves a level of parity in the Pacific, and if the US has suffered such great losses that China feels comfortable striking toward Hawaii or even the US mainland, nuclear weapons could well be used as a response. Luckily, neither of those scenarios seems particularly likely to play out. As for when and why China might use its nuclear weapons, in the scenario that we laid out here, the option we mentioned earlier bears repeating. If the US were to inflict crippling damage on Beijing or China's ability to launch nuclear weapons, or on absolutely critical targets like the Three Gorges Dam, Beijing may feel as if it's got to begin a nuclear exchange in response. Another scenario might be a rogue North Korea, where it's actually Pyongyang that launches bombs first, but China, knowing that the US will presume its responsibility and target it anyway, attempts a preemptive strike. But in the scenario we played out, where China is able to whittle away the US and East Asia through conventional warfare, the nation would actually be disincentivized from using nuclear weapons, if at all avoidable. After all, if China goes and starts a nuclear exchange, then all its hard work will have been for nothing, and it might as well have simply begun the process of Armageddon earlier while cutting out that tedious middle bit. Instead, if China's willing to engage in an all-out war with the US at all, we can probably assume that Beijing would like to enjoy the benefits that would come with a victory, and you can't enjoy the spoils of war if they've all been turned into ash. With a whole lot of luck, the US and China may be able to avert war in the future years and decades. Perhaps China will be able to resist the temptation to make a move against Taiwan, or perhaps all those American security guarantees will come to nothing and Taiwan will be sacrificed when the moment finally comes. Perhaps China will judge that the US is ripping itself apart at the seams and simply sit back and let it happen. Perhaps the US would be able to prove itself vastly superior to China in a brief military altercation, one that wraps up so decisively that neither a prolonged war nor a nuclear exchange are required. Or perhaps, dare we even say it, diplomacy might win the day and both sides might find some mechanism to de-escalate before the worst can happen. If there's any solace to take in today's episode, it's the fact that none of what we laid out actually needs to transpire. There are plenty of other ways for these two nations to settle their differences, and hopefully those other paths will be the ones that each side will follow. But if a full-scale war between China and America does break out, then make no mistake, we have a name for it. That's World War III. If you happen to know of an expert who thinks that World War III ends well for anyone, then please let us know who they are. We've yet to find anybody who agrees. Thank you for watching.